This is my true story. I lost my son 50 years ago in a flood that destroyed our entire town, watched the river swallow him while I could only save my wife, and I spent 5 decades mourning the child I couldn't protect from the rushing water. I kept his bedroom exactly as it was for half a century, celebrated his birthday every year with an empty chair at the table, and slowly died inside while pretending to live. But last week, a man in his 50s approached me in a Nevada grocery store and called me father. You won't believe what happened next. Before that, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And please subscribe to this channel so that my stories can reach more people. 50 years ago, the river that ran through our small town overflowed its banks during the worst storm anyone in the region could remember, turning from a peaceful waterway into a raging monster that swallowed houses and cars and lives without mercy or warning. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, heavy sheets of water that turned roads into rivers and saturated the ground until it couldn't absorb anymore. And by the 4th morning, the warnings came that everyone needed to evacuate immediately because the levees were failing and the water was coming. We had maybe 30 minutes to grab what we could and run, 30 minutes between hearing the sirens and watching our entire neighborhood disappear under brown churning water that rose faster than anyone thought possible. I grabbed my wife's hand and reached for my 5-year-old son who was standing right beside me in our living room. But in the chaos of trying to move toward the door, while water was already pouring through the windows, I felt his small fingers slip from my grip. The current was so strong, moving so fast through our house, and I saw him swept away from me in an instant, saw his terrified face disappear under the water before I could grab him back. I screamed his name and tried to go after him, but the water knocked me down, and my wife was pulling on my arm, begging me not to let go of her, and I had to make a choice in that split second between saving her or trying to save him, and I chose wrong because I let the current take my son while I held on to my wife. We made it to higher ground along with other survivors, and as soon as the water started receding, I went back to search for my boy, wading through the muddy devastation calling his name until my voice gave out completely. I searched for weeks, walked miles of riverbank looking for any sign of him, talked to every rescue worker and volunteer and survivor, asking if anyone had seen a 5-year-old boy with brown hair and green eyes. They found bodies of other children who had been caught in the flood, found them miles downstream or trapped in debris or washed up on shores far from where they had been taken. But they never found my son's body no matter how long I searched or how desperately I needed closure. After 6 weeks, the authorities told me to stop searching, said that the river had probably carried him too far for his body to ever be recovered, said I needed to accept that he was gone and start the process of grieving and moving forward with my life. They issued a death certificate based on witness testimony that he had been swept away in the flood, based on the statistical reality that no child could have survived that long without being found, based on the need to provide legal closure even when there were no physical remains to bury. We held a funeral service with an empty coffin, stood around a grave that contained nothing but our grief, and I listened to people tell me that my son was in a better place now and that I needed to be strong for my wife and that time would heal this wound. But time doesn't heal the loss of a child, doesn't make it easier to accept that you failed to protect the small person you brought into this world and promised to keep safe. Every night for 50 years, I replayed those moments in my mind. Saw his fingers slipping from my grip over and over again, wondered if I had reached faster or held tighter or made different choices whether he would still be alive. I tortured myself with what-ifs and maybes and alternative scenarios where I saved my son instead of letting the flood take him. And I never forgave myself for choosing my wife over my child, even though I know there was no good choice in that impossible moment. I became a ghost after that day, someone who looked alive but was really dead inside, someone who moved through the world without ever really living in it again. The flood destroyed our town and killed dozens of people, but for me, it killed everything that mattered when it took my 5-year-old son and left me standing on higher ground alive but destroyed. I never moved on from losing my son, no matter how many people told me I needed to let go and start living again. And for 50 years, I kept his bedroom exactly as it was on the day the flood took him. His toys still arranged on shelves and his clothes still hanging in the closet, and his bed still made the way he had left it that final morning. I couldn't bring myself to pack away his things or change anything about that room, because doing so would feel like erasing him from existence, like admitting he was really gone and never coming back. I would sit in that room sometimes just staring at his toys, remembering how he used to play with them, hearing his laugh in my memory, even though the sound had faded over the decades, until I wasn't sure anymore if I was remembering his actual voice or just an echo of what I thought it sounded like. Every birthday, I celebrated the son who wasn't there, baked a cake and sang happy birthday to an empty room. Added another candle to mark another year that he should have lived but didn't, because I failed to hold on to him when the water came. He would have been 10, then 20, then 30, then 40, then 50, and I marked every milestone wondering what kind of person he would have become if he had survived. Would he have gone to college, gotten married, given me grandchildren, built a life that I could have been part of? I created entire imaginary versions of his life. Scenarios where he grew up and succeeded and stayed close to his father. And I mourned not just the 5-year-old who drowned, but all the versions of him that never got to exist. Every Christmas I set a place for him at the table, put out a plate and silverware for the son who would never eat another meal with us, and I would sit there looking at that empty chair, trying to pretend he was just running late or in another room instead of dead for decades. My wife did the same thing, both of us participating in this shared delusion that our son might somehow walk through the door and join us. And we never talked about how crazy it was to set a place for a dead child, because acknowledging the insanity would mean facing the full weight of our loss without the comfort of pretending. My wife passed away 20 years ago, her heart giving out after 5 decades of carrying grief that was too heavy for any person to bear for that long. She died still mourning our son. Her last words to me, asking if I thought he was waiting for her wherever she was going, if she would finally get to hold him again after all these years of empty arms. I buried her next to the empty grave we had dug for our son 50 years earlier, putting them together in death since they couldn't be together in life. And after her funeral, I became even more of a ghost than I had been before, because now I had lost both of them. I lived alone in the house we had rebuilt after the flood. The house that replaced the one that was destroyed by the water that took my son, and every room reminded me of what I had lost. I continued working just to have something to do with my days, continued going through the motions of living without actually being alive in any meaningful sense. I had no friends because I had pushed everyone away over the decades of grief, had no hobbies or interests because nothing mattered anymore when the only thing I cared about was gone. Had no reason to exist except that my body stubbornly kept breathing and my heart stubbornly kept beating, even though both should have stopped 50 years ago. People who knew my story felt sorry for me. The old man who never recovered from losing his son in the flood. The father who kept a shrine to a dead child for half a century. They probably thought I was mentally ill or unable to accept reality, and maybe they were right, but I didn't care what anyone thought because their opinions couldn't hurt me more than I was already hurting every single day of my existence. Last week I traveled to Nevada for routine office work, one of those occasional business trips that my company required even though I was 75 years old and probably should have retired decades ago, but kept working because the alternative was sitting alone in my house with nothing but memories and grief to keep me company. The trip was supposed to be simple: fly to Nevada for a few days to review some documents and attend some meetings, stay in a cheap hotel and eat meals by myself, then fly home to continue my existence as a living ghost haunted by a son who died 50 years ago. I had made this same trip dozens of times over the years, always alone, always just going through the motions of a job I didn't care about, but that gave me somewhere to be besides an empty house. I was exhausted from the meetings and the travel, my 75-year-old body not handling long flights and time zone changes as well as it used to, and all I wanted was to get some coffee and maybe a sandwich before heading back to my hotel room to sleep. I stopped at a grocery store near my hotel, one of those large chains that looks the same in every city and state, and I walked through the automatic doors into the fluorescent lighting and air conditioning that felt too cold after the Nevada heat outside. I grabbed a shopping basket and headed toward the coffee aisle, moving slowly because my knees hurt and my back ached, and everything about being old and alone made even simple tasks feel difficult. I was standing in front of the coffee selection, trying to decide between brands I didn't care about when I heard a voice behind me. A man's voice that sounded shaky and uncertain and filled with emotion I couldn't identify. The voice said, "Father." Just that one word. And at first I thought he was talking to someone else because nobody called me father anymore. Not since my son died and my wife followed him 20 years later. I ignored the voice and kept looking at coffee, but then I heard it again, louder this time and definitely directed at me. The word father spoken with a mix of disbelief and hope and something that sounded like fear. I turned around slowly, expecting to see a confused stranger who had mistaken me for someone else, expecting to have to tell him I wasn't whoever he thought I was, and watch him apologize and walk away embarrassed. But when I faced the man who had called me father, I felt something in my chest that I hadn't felt in 50 years. A jolt of recognition that made no sense but that I couldn't deny no matter how impossible it seemed. The man was in his 50s, weathered and aged by decades of living, but his eyes were the same eyes I had seen in my nightmares every night for half a century. The same green eyes that belonged to my 5-year-old son, who had drowned in a flood before he could grow into a man. I stood there frozen, unable to speak or move or process what I was seeing, and the man took a step toward me with tears streaming down his face, tears that had appeared the moment he said that word father and had been falling continuously since then. He looked nothing like the 5-year-old boy I had lost, was a complete stranger in every physical way, except for those eyes that I would recognize anywhere, no matter how much time had passed or how much the rest of him had changed. He whispered the words that would destroy my entire understanding of the past 50 years. Whispered them so quietly, I almost couldn't hear him over the grocery store sounds of shopping carts and checkout beeps and other people's conversations. He said, "It's me," said, "I'm your son," said, "I survived the flood." And those words hit me like physical blows that knocked the breath out of my lungs and made my vision go dark around the edges. I thought I was having a heart attack. Thought my 75-year-old body was finally giving out from shock. Thought I was dying in a Nevada grocery store while hallucinating my dead son standing in front of me alive and grown and impossible. I stared at this man in his 50s, trying to find my 5-year-old son in his weathered face, trying to match the child I had memorized through decades of grief with the adult standing in front of me, claiming to be that same person after 50 years of being dead. He looked nothing like my boy in any obvious way, was tall and broad where my son had been small and delicate, had lines and scars and gray hair where my son had smooth skin and youth, had lived an entire lifetime that should have been impossible if he really had drowned in that flood. But those eyes were unmistakable, the exact shade of green that I had seen only once in my life on my son's face, a color so specific that I couldn't pretend this was coincidence or mistake. He stepped closer to me, and I stepped back instinctively, my mind refusing to accept what my eyes were seeing, my body reacting with fear to something that should have been joy but felt more like terror because dead children don't come back after 50 years. He stopped moving when he saw my fear and just stood there crying openly in the middle of a grocery store, tears running down his face, while other shoppers walked past, giving us strange looks, but not intervening because people don't involve themselves in strangers' emotional moments. He said my name, said it correctly with the pronunciation that most people got wrong, said it the way only someone who knew me personally would say it. He told me details about our old house that nobody except family would know, described the layout of rooms that had been destroyed in the flood 50 years ago. Mentioned things that only my son could remember about his childhood before the water took him. He described the color of his bedroom walls, the stuffed animal he slept with every night, the way I used to read him stories before bed, details that proved he was who he claimed to be, even though my brain was still insisting this was impossible. I felt my legs getting weak, and I had to grab onto a shelf to keep from falling. My 75-year-old body not equipped to handle the shock of seeing my dead son alive and middle-aged in front of me. Other shoppers were definitely staring now, probably wondering why an old man was having some kind of episode in the coffee aisle, probably debating whether to call for help or just avoid the awkward scene. But I didn't care about them, could only focus on this man's face, trying to see past the 50 years of aging to find the child underneath, trying to reconcile the son I buried with the adult claiming to be him. He reached out slowly like he was approaching a frightened animal and touched my arm gently, and that physical contact made everything real in a way that looking at him hadn't. Made my brain accept that this wasn't a dream or hallucination, but an actual person standing in front of me. He suggested we go somewhere private to talk, said we couldn't have this conversation in the middle of a grocery store. Said he had a car outside and we could sit there while he explained everything. I nodded because I couldn't form words yet, my voice completely gone from shock, and I followed him through the store and out to the parking lot, moving like someone in a trance. His car was an old truck with tools in the back, the vehicle of a working man who did physical labor for a living, and we got inside and sat there in silence for several minutes while I tried to make my brain work again. He was the first to speak, started talking in a voice that was gentle and patient, like he understood I needed time to process what was happening. He said he knew this was a shock, said he had imagined this moment 1,000 times over the years, said he had been looking for me for decades but never had the courage to actually make contact until he saw me standing in that grocery store and couldn't let the opportunity pass. And then he started telling me his story. The explanation for how my dead son was sitting alive beside me 50 years after I watched him drown. We sat in his truck in that grocery store parking lot for 3 hours while he told me everything that had happened after the flood swept him away from my grip, and every word he spoke destroyed another piece of the life I thought I had lived for the past 50 years. He said the current had carried him miles downstream, tumbling him through the brown water until he hit something hard that knocked him unconscious, and he had washed up on a riverbank far from our town with no memory of who he was or where he came from. A farmer found him lying in the mud, barely breathing, brought him to his farmhouse, called for medical help, and when no missing child reports matched his description in the chaos after the flood, the authorities assumed he was an orphan whose family had all died in the disaster. The farmer and his wife had no children of their own and decided to raise my son as if he were theirs. Gave him their last name, created a new birth certificate with false information, essentially adopted him without going through any legal process because the system was overwhelmed after the flood and nobody was checking too carefully. My son said he had no memory of his life before the flood. For the first 7 years he lived with the farmer. No recollection of me or his mother or our house or anything from his first 5 years of existence. The head injury he suffered had wiped out those early memories completely, leaving him a blank slate that the farmer filled with a new identity and a new story about being rescued from the flood as an orphan. But when he was 12 years old, the memories started coming back in pieces, fragments of his real life before the flood that didn't match the story he had been told about being an orphan. He remembered my face, remembered his mother, remembered our house and his toys and moments from his real childhood that proved he had a family somewhere who might still be looking for him. He told the farmer about these memories, and the farmer admitted the truth, that he had been found with no identification, and that efforts to locate his family had failed in the chaos after the disaster. The farmer said he had assumed my son's parents were dead, that keeping him seemed like the kind thing to do rather than sending him into the foster system, that he had grown to love the boy as his own and hoped he would understand. My son said he was confused and angry at first, demanded that the farmer help him find his real parents, wanted to go back to the family he was starting to remember more clearly as the memories continued returning. But the farmer told him that our town had been destroyed, that most people had moved away or died, that trying to find his parents after 7 years would be nearly impossible without even knowing their last name or having any documentation. The farmer suggested waiting, said they would try to locate his family when he was older. But my son said he could tell the farmer was scared of losing him and was probably not trying as hard as he claimed to find my real identity. By the time he was 15, the memories were fully back and he knew exactly who he was, knew his real name and his parents' names and details about his life before the flood. He went to the library and looked through old newspapers about the flood, found articles listing the dead and missing, and saw his own name listed as presumed dead with a photo of me and his mother at his funeral service standing beside an empty grave. He read that I had searched for weeks, that his mother had died of grief years later, that I was still alive but had never remarried or moved on from losing him. He said he wanted desperately to find me then, to tell me he was alive, to come home to the father who had mourned him for 15 years. But he was terrified that I had moved on, that I might have a new family, that showing up alive after being declared dead might hurt me more than help me. He was just a confused teenager who didn't know how to process any of this, and the farmer convinced him to wait until he was older and more certain about what he wanted to do. My son told me he built an entire life in Nevada over the decades that followed, staying with the farmer who raised him until he was 18, and then moving into his own place and finding work as a mechanic because he had a talent for fixing things and working with his hands. He met a woman when he was 25 and fell in love with her the way young people do. Married her in a small ceremony that I should have attended but didn't because I thought he was dead and buried in an empty grave back home. They had 2 children together, a son and a daughter who grew up calling him dad and never knowing that their father had another family somewhere else, another life he had lived before the flood erased his first 5 years and gave him a completely different existence. He worked hard and provided for his family, built a modest but comfortable life doing honest labor, and from the outside, he probably looked like any other middle-aged man with a wife and kids and a job that paid the bills. But he said he thought about me every single day for 50 years, wondered where I was and whether I was still alive, carried guilt about not finding me sooner or telling me he had survived. He said he saw my name in a local newspaper about 10 years ago, some business article mentioning the company I worked for, and he realized I had relocated to the same state he lived in without either of us knowing how close we were to each other. He tracked down my address through public records, found out where I lived, and one weekend he drove to my neighborhood and parked across the street from my house just to see if he could catch a glimpse of me. He said he did this a dozen times over the following years, sitting in his truck watching my house, seeing me come and go occasionally, observing the life I lived alone in that empty house with no family and no visitors. He said he saw how lonely I looked, how I moved like someone who had given up on living, and each time he watched me, he felt more guilty about not knocking on my door and telling me the truth. But he never found the courage to approach me, paralyzed by fear about how I would react after 50 years of believing he was dead. He worried I would be angry that he had waited so long to contact me, worried I would reject him for choosing to stay with the farmer instead of searching harder for his real family, worried that showing up alive after 5 decades might cause me more pain than relief. He also felt trapped by the life he had built, unable to imagine how he would explain to his wife and children that he had a father who didn't know he existed, that his entire identity before age 5 was something he had hidden from everyone, including the people closest to him. He said he convinced himself over the years that I was probably better off not knowing he had survived, that dragging me back into his life would only complicate things for both of us, that the man sitting alone in that house was too broken to handle the shock of a dead son returning. He made excuses and rationalized his silence, told himself he would contact me eventually when the time was right. But years kept passing, and the time was never right, and his guilt kept growing along with his fear. He had chosen his life in Nevada with the family he built over returning to the father who mourned him, and that choice became harder to undo with each year that passed and each moment he let slip by without knocking on my door. So he lived 50 years parallel to me, both of us in the same state for the last decade, both of us alone in different ways, him carrying the secret of being alive while I carried the grief of believing he was dead. He had everything I would have wanted for him, a wife who loved him, and children who adored him, and a life that was full and meaningful. But knowing he had all of that, while deliberately choosing not to include me, felt like a betrayal worse than death. After he finished telling me his story, after 3 hours of explanations that still didn't make sense to me or heal the 50 years of grief I had carried unnecessarily, I grabbed both of his hands in mine and begged him to come home with me. Tears were pouring down my 75-year-old face, my voice breaking as I told him I never stopped looking for him, that I kept his room exactly as it was for 50 years, that I celebrated his birthday every year and set a place for him at Christmas dinner, even though he was supposedly dead. I told him about his mother dying of grief 20 years ago, still mourning the son she lost. Told him how I had lived as a ghost for 5 decades, punishing myself for letting his fingers slip from my grip in that flood. Told him that finding him alive was a miracle I never thought I would experience. I begged him to please come back to me, to come home where he belonged, to let me finally have the son I had mourned for half a century. I said we could make up for lost time, could build a relationship even though he was 55 years old and I was 75, could finally be father and son again, the way we were supposed to be before the flood destroyed everything. I said I didn't care about the 50 years he was gone, didn't care that he had a whole life I knew nothing about, just wanted him back in my life in whatever capacity he was willing to give. I would take anything, any amount of time or attention, just the knowledge that my son was alive and I could see him and talk to him and know he existed in the world. But he pulled his hands away from mine gently, his face full of pain and something that looked like pity, and he said words that destroyed me more completely than the flood ever had. He said he couldn't come home, said he had responsibilities here in Nevada that he couldn't just abandon, said he had a wife and children who needed him and depended on him and knew nothing about his life before he was 5 years old. He said his wife thought he was an orphan, that his children believed their father had no living relatives, that revealing my existence would require him to explain 50 years of lies and secrets that would devastate the family he had built. He said it wouldn't be fair to his wife to suddenly uproot their life so he could reconnect with a father she didn't know existed, that it wouldn't be fair to his adult children to tell them their grandfather had been alive all this time and their father had known for decades but chose not to tell them. He said he couldn't explain where he had been or why he never reached out without making himself look like a terrible person who abandoned his grieving father for 50 years, and that admission would destroy his relationships with the people he loved. He had built his life on the foundation of being an orphan, raised by a kind farmer, and telling the truth would crack that foundation and bring everything crashing down. I listened to him explain all the reasons why he couldn't come home to me, all the logical, practical concerns about his wife and children and the life he had built, and none of it mattered to me because I was his father who had mourned him for 50 years, and I needed him more than anyone else possibly could. I told him we could figure out how to tell his family, could find a way to introduce me gradually, could make this work if he just tried. But he kept shaking his head, kept saying he was sorry, kept insisting that his obligations to his wife and children had to come first, even though his obligation to me should have come first 50 years ago when he realized he was alive and chose not to find me. He said the words that finished destroying my heart, said Dad. I can't be your son again, said the most he could offer was meeting occasionally for coffee or meals when our schedules allowed. He was offering me crumbs when I deserved the whole loaf, offering me occasional visits when I had earned the right to have him back completely after 50 years of unnecessary grief. He pulled out his phone and showed me photos of his family, pictures of a beautiful woman who was his wife and 2 adult children who had his eyes and his smile, people who looked happy and loved and completely unaware that their husband and father had a secret past that included me. His wife looked kind in the photos, the sort of person who probably believed she knew everything about the man she married, who probably thought she was his entire world and his only family. His children looked successful and settled, probably with their own families and careers, completely ignorant of the grandfather who had been alive their entire lives, mourning a son he thought was dead. These were good people who loved my son, who had given him the family life he deserved, who had filled the hole that losing us must have created in his heart after the flood. He talked about them with obvious love and pride, told me his son worked as a teacher and his daughter was a nurse, said they were good people who he was proud to have raised. He said his wife had stood by him through difficult times, had supported him when work was scarce, had been his partner in building the life they shared. He described birthdays and holidays and ordinary moments that made up a lifetime of memories with these people, and I understood very clearly that they were his real family now, in ways that I could never be again. I was a ghost from his past, a 5-year-old boy's father who had disappeared along with that child when the flood swept him away, and the man sitting beside me had built a complete life without me that I had no place in. He said he was sorry over and over again while showing me these photos, apologizing for letting me suffer for 50 years, apologizing for not finding me sooner, apologizing for not being brave enough to knock on my door when he had the chance. But his apologies felt empty, because if he was truly sorry, he would choose to fix what he had broken, would make the difficult choice to bring me into his life properly, instead of offering me occasional coffee visits like I was an old acquaintance instead of his father. He said he thought about me constantly, said the guilt of knowing I was alive and mourning him had eaten at him for years. But apparently, that guilt wasn't strong enough to make him actually do anything about it, until random chance put us in the same grocery store at the same time. He explained that he had responsibilities to his wife and children that had to take priority, that he couldn't just disrupt their lives by revealing a secret father he had hidden from them for decades, that maintaining their stability and happiness was more important than reconnecting with me after 50 years. He said this like it was reasonable, like I should understand and accept that the family he built was more valuable than the family he came from. Like my 50 years of grief should be less important than his wife's comfort and his children's confusion if they learned the truth. He had made his choice long ago when he decided not to find me, and he was making that same choice again now by refusing to fully welcome me back into his life, even after seeing my tears and hearing my begging. He said we could meet sometimes, maybe once every few months when he could get away without his wife asking too many questions. Maybe for coffee or lunch at restaurants far from his home where nobody would recognize him. He said he would call me occasionally, would stay in touch as much as he could without arousing suspicion from the family who thought he was an orphan with no living relatives. He was offering me scraps of time and attention, asking me to be satisfied with being his secret while his real life continued with the people who actually mattered to him. He kept saying, "I'm sorry," like those words could heal 50 years of wounds. Like apologizing would make it okay that he was choosing them over me again, just like he had chosen them over me every day for the past 5 decades. I looked at this stranger with my son's eyes and realized that the 5-year-old boy I lost in the flood really was dead. That the man sitting beside me was someone else entirely, who happened to have my son's memories, but none of his love. I found my son after 50 years of mourning him, found him alive and healthy and whole. And the discovery destroyed me more completely than his death ever did, because death at least had finality and closure that this situation lacked. When I thought he was dead, I could grieve properly, could accept that the flood took him through no fault of anyone except perhaps my own failure to hold on tight enough, could eventually make some kind of peace with losing him, even if that peace was hollow and incomplete. But finding him alive meant learning that all those years of grief were unnecessary. That he had been living and breathing and building a life while I was dying inside believing he was gone, that I had suffered for nothing because he survived and chose not to tell me. The flood didn't take my son from me the way I had believed for 50 years. Life took him from me through a series of choices and circumstances that kept us apart, even though we were both alive and eventually living in the same state. He was taken by the farmer who found him and raised him without trying hard enough to locate his real family. Taken by a system that was too overwhelmed after the disaster to properly identify one small boy among hundreds of displaced children. Taken by his own fear and confusion when his memories returned and he didn't know how to find his way back to me. But most devastatingly, he was taken by his own choice when he decided that reconnecting with his real father was too difficult or complicated or disruptive to his comfortable life with the family he had built to replace us. I had spent 50 years torturing myself with guilt over letting his fingers slip from my grip in that flood, replaying that moment over and over, wondering if I could have held on tighter or reached faster or made different choices that would have saved him. I carried the weight of his death like a stone around my neck that dragged me down and made every day feel like drowning, even though I was on dry land. I punished myself for surviving when he didn't, for choosing to save my wife instead of diving into the current after my son, for failing in the most basic duty of a parent, which is protecting your child from harm. But now I learned that all that guilt was based on a false premise, that he didn't die that day, that my failure wasn't in letting him go, but in not finding him after he survived. The grief I felt discovering he was alive was different from the grief of believing he was dead, sharper and more bitter, because it came with the knowledge that this loss was preventable and ongoing. He wasn't taken from me by forces beyond anyone's control. He was kept from me by decisions that people made, including him, and that meant someone was to blame for 50 years of unnecessary suffering. I wanted to be angry at the farmer who raised him, at the authorities who failed to identify him properly, at my son himself for not trying harder to find me once his memories returned. But anger required energy I didn't have. And beneath the anger was just profound sadness that we had both been alive all this time and never got to know each other as the men we became. Finding him alive meant learning that he had a whole life I wasn't part of, a wife who knew him better than I ever would, children who called him Dad while I was celebrating his birthday alone in an empty room, memories and experiences that I wasn't present for and could never be part of retroactively. He had lived an entire adulthood without me, 50 years of moments and milestones and ordinary days that I missed completely. His first day of school after the flood, his graduation from high school, his wedding day, the births of his children, all of it happened without me there because he was dead to me while he was actually just living somewhere else. The man I found in that grocery store had my son's DNA and my son's earliest memories. But he wasn't my son anymore in any meaningful way because my son died at 5 years old in my arms during a flood, and the person who survived was someone else who happened to look like him. I flew home alone after that meeting in Nevada, his phone number saved in my contacts, but feeling as distant and unreachable as he had been when I thought he was dead. His promise to meet sometimes echoing hollow in my head during the entire flight back to the empty house where I had mourned him for 50 years. I sat in my airplane seat staring out the window at clouds that looked solid enough to walk on, thinking about how I had spent half a century grieving a son who was alive the entire time building a family that didn't include me. The other passengers probably thought I was just another tired old man flying home from a business trip, had no idea the person sitting beside them had just lost his son for the second time in 50 years. My son is alive somewhere in Nevada right now, breathing and working and eating dinner with his wife, and probably not thinking about his father who he abandoned twice, once when the flood took him and once when he chose his other family over reconnecting with me properly. I am still mourning him, but now I'm mourning not the 5-year-old who drowned, but the 55-year-old man who survived and decided I wasn't worth coming back to, wasn't worth the difficulty of explaining to his wife and children, wasn't worth disrupting his comfortable life for. This grief is worse than the old grief because it comes with knowledge instead of assumptions, with certainty instead of hope, with the understanding that my son made an active choice to exclude me from his life. We have met twice since that day in the grocery store, awkward meetings at coffee shops halfway between our homes where we sat across from each other like strangers trying to find common ground that doesn't exist after 50 years of separation. He tells me about his work and his family in the careful way people discuss safe topics with acquaintances they don't know well. And I tell him about my lonely life in sentences that feel inadequate to capture 50 years of grief. He checks his watch frequently during these meetings, clearly anxious about getting home before his wife starts asking questions about where he has been. And I watch him check the time and feel my heart break a little more each time he prioritizes her comfort over my need for my son. I memorize his face during these brief meetings, trying to overlay the 55-year-old man with the 5-year-old boy I lost, trying to find my child in this stranger who shares my blood but not my life. Sometimes I see glimpses of the boy he was in the way he smiles or laughs, moments where the 50 years dissolve, and I can almost pretend we didn't lose half a century to circumstances and choices that kept us apart. But then he checks his watch again, or mentions needing to leave soon, and the illusion shatters. And I remember that I am not his father in any real sense, just a biological connection he tolerates occasionally out of guilt rather than love. I lost my son 50 years ago in a flood that swept him from my arms, while I held on to my wife instead. And last week he called me father in a grocery store and destroyed my entire understanding of the past 5 decades. I begged him to come home and he said no, said he had a family that mattered more than I did, said the most he could offer was occasional coffee visits that feel more like torture than comfort. I found my son alive after 50 years of mourning him, and the discovery was more painful than burying him ever was, because death at least is final, while this half-life of occasional meetings and phone calls that never come is a wound that stays open and bleeding. He survived the flood that I thought killed him, but I am still drowning in grief that is deeper and colder now, because it comes with the knowledge that he chose this distance, chose his comfort over my healing, chose to let me suffer rather than face the difficulty of bringing me fully into his life. My son is alive, and I am still mourning him, still keeping his childhood room exactly as it was, still setting a place for him at holidays he will never attend because the man he became decided his 5-year-old father isn't worth the trouble of loving properly.